Good day to you. I thought I'd change the location of the instructor video today for you to shake things up a little bit. I'm in the Monroe building. This is what it would be like if we were still on campus, but we're not during this pandemic. And as I walk down the hallway, I see offices of my colleagues. Yeah, professors. And we're a subgroup. We're a subgroup at the university. We're a subgroup because we have our own language. We talk about things like FTE when we're by ourselves. That's faculty teaching exchange ratio. It's a technical term used to decide whether you have a good workload or not as a professor. We talk about tenure, talk about promotion. We talk about literature reviews. We talk about pass-fail grades. Yeah, we're all up here, all the professors in the Monroe building. And we're a subgroup, like I said. And that's the subject of today's discussion. As I come into my office here, here's where we would have been meeting had we had an office consultation. Yeah, subgroups is what our focus is today as we take on Chapter 12. And we want to distinguish between a subgroup and a subculture right at the outset. Those terms seemingly are confusing, are they not? But a subculture is a larger group than a subgroup. And a subculture exists within the dominant culture and is not necessarily dependent on that culture, whereas a subgroup operates with a lot of dependency on the dominant culture and has a lot less autonomy and power. So that's what we're talking about. We're talking about subgroups today as we head into this chapter. Subgroups, by the way, don't normally transmit values and patterns of behavior over generations like subcultures do. So there tends to be a temporary quality to subgroups. And what we're going to do is we're going to focus on the language of communicating in subgroup identity today and how language as a function of communication can help a subgroup or hurt a subgroup. That's what we're talking about today. When we're talking about subgroups, there are lots of different examples. For example, people who listen to rap music, they have their own language, and there's their own language within rap. And then there's sports fans. They certainly have their own language that they use when they're speaking about sports. And then we have pot smokers. People who smoke weed have so many different words for marijuana. It's a great example of a language that is unique to a subgroup. Then we have New Yorkers. A lot of New Yorkers have moved out of Pennsylvania. Excuse me one sec. Yeah, a lot of subgroups have moved out from Pennsylvania, from New York, and they bring with them the language of New York. And then there's professors, like I mentioned, and farmers and LGBTQ people, which we're going to highlight in today's chapter. So those are just some examples to give you some tangible examples of subgroups. Now let's go into the idea of specialized vocabulary, which I've alluded to. I'm going to pause this. All right, to continue, that was somebody trying to sell me some software to teach students. It's something that professors work with all the time, is vendors trying to sell us stuff to teach students. That was a software company called Top Hat, and I'm sure they have their own subgroup and their own language. And that's what we were talking about. We're talking about specialized vocabulary and how specialized vocabulary within a subgroup defines the boundaries of that subgroup and also exhibits the entry requirements to get into that subgroup, because you've got to be able to speak that language. The specialized vocabulary is called different terms in the book. It's called jargon. I'm sure you know that word. It's called an argot. You may not know that one. That might be a new word. It's called slang, and it's also called a cant, C-A-N-T. And so the language that a group uses, very specialized, it's unique to that subgroup, establishes that group's boundaries. And the preciseness of the meaning of that language is known only to the subgroup. If you're from Philadelphia, you probably have the feeling that only you truly know the meaning of the word John. You can see John on a billboard as you're driving down on a McDonald's ad, for example. What's your John, for example? But only people who are in Philadelphia using it to refer to people, places, and things have that true sense, or at least the feeling that they know what that word means, John. And media also contribute to the use of vocabulary that helps establish subgroups. You can look at a phraseology that's being used right now on Fox News, for example. Fox News is using the phraseology called cancel culture. Do you know what that is, cancel culture? It's a way of arguing against the removal of Confederate statues, which has been happening now as the U.S. continues to example systemic racism, and removing those Confederate statues for some is a way of removing the past of slavery. But Fox News has a different belief system, and they are talking about a cancel culture, which is getting across a meaning that taking away those statues is getting rid of your history. And similarly, on the other side of the equation, CNN has a commentary that's going on where they're constantly recording, in their view, the lies of President Trump. They're constantly saying, President Trump told X amount of untruths this week. President Trump told this amount of lies. So the very specialized vocabulary that exists within Fox News fans and CNN fans, which are totally different, it contributes to the subgroup identity. Now let's move on to 3 different subgroups which Fred Yant talks about in his chapter. I'm going to just skim them myself. You can read about them in more detail. The first is British punk, which I had a direct experience of as a 16-year-old. I was working in a restaurant, and in that restaurant we had a disco. And so people would come and eat fine dining, and then they would have a disco dance floor that people would go out onto and start drinking, complete with the disco ball. And the music was pounding and throbbing and coming in through the kitchen. I could hear it every single night. And in that context, punk rock rose up to try and move against rock and roll and to move against disco. And punk rock was very irreverent. And there's irreverent means, disrespectful of established institutions. And there's a very famous set of studies done by the cultural analyst Dick Hebridge in 1979. And he talks at length about how the language of the subgroup of punk rockers includes diverse and incompatible music traditions. Like if you listen to punk rock, you'll hear some brass, which is kind of sounding like jazz, but you'll also hear out-of-tune guitars, so it's rock and roll, but not really as rock and roll was meant to be. You hear screaming, you hear a lot of talk about drugs, you hear a lot of talk about taking down established institutions. Piss off was a word that was used by the Sex Pistols in a lot of their language in punk rock as it appeared in the 1970s. So punk rock has a subgroup mentality and identity to it through the use of its language. And it comes out of the British working class, people struggling for a living, and music is the ticket out of those poverty conditions. But also, the language of punk rock constructed what Fred Yant calls otherness. And otherness is a term used throughout the chapter. It's not his term. The idea of otherness is when you use language to talk about another group and you separate out that group and make them appear as if they are different, weird, abnormal, a threat, etc. They are not part of the mainstream, so you other another person. And that's what happened with punk rock. Punk rock was not accepted by the music establishment. It had very little support from record labels. Rock and rollers criticized it heavily, and so did disco people. It was a very irreverent form of music that was not really accepted at that time, except by the people who celebrated punk rock because they are in the subgroup, the people who are fans. Now let's move on to a second subgroup that Fred Yant talks about, and this is the corporate culture. The corporate culture, that phrase was a buzzword in the 1980s. I remember it well. And it basically communicates this is the way that we do things around here for the corporation. And in fact, corporations have their own dress code, their own status symbol, their own heroes. Yeah, heroes function very widely in subgroups. And founders of organizations can become big heroes. Like Steve Jobs is still a hero figure today, even though he passed away, in the way that he created Apple. He didn't have a college education. He was fired from Apple, then rehired. Then he came out with the iPhone, which 90% of the people in this class probably have. He has legendary status, Bill Gates. So founders of organizations have legendary status. If you take the Black Entertainment Channel, Robert Johnson, he has a legendary status within people who consider themselves a subgroup who like BET. Robert Johnson wrote out on a napkin his idea for BET in Washington. And he went to ask a friend for a loan, and he got that loan, and he established this very successful network, which is still today has a high profile on cable channels across the United States. So subgroups establish their cultures, and that happens in corporations like the BET corporations. And organizations can also have mythologies to guide behaviors. There's a myth at ESU, looking at ESU not as a corporation but as an organization. There's a myth at ESU that if you go to a class, back when we could sit in class, and the professor is 10 minutes late, then you're allowed to leave if they're an instructor. But if they're a professor, you have to wait 15 minutes before you leave. Students roundly consider this to be fact. It is in fact a myth, and it does in fact guide the behavior of students who will wait 10 minutes if the professor doesn't show up based on the professor's rank and then leave, or 15 minutes depending on if the professor is, or the instructor is, a professor. So there are myths that guide organizations. And organizations can have values as well. Many people in this class will like Chick-fil-A, but Chick-fil-A has values. It has values that are considered to be traditional Christian religious values. They donate heavily to President Trump and his campaign. They donate heavily to anti-gay causes. They have made statements about conversion therapy, which is to convert homosexuals back to heterosexuality. So organizations have values. And those values don't necessarily extend just to politics. They extend to our lifestyles. There are values that come out of organizations having to do with what is the appropriate amount of vacation time. And many of you will grow up in this society believing that 2 weeks is the appropriate amount of vacation time, whereas, as I mentioned in a previous class, Europe provides 5 weeks. So corporations are also a good example of subgroups. Within this section, Fred Yant examines a case study with Southwest Airlines. Southwest Airlines, with its advertising slogan, "Want to get away?" Again, that's establishing a value. That's saying that an airline is not to be used for business or visiting family. It's to say you want to get the hell out of where you are to try something different. That's a value that comes through with Southwest Airlines. There's also a brief case study of Google. In this chapter, Google is known as a flat company when it comes to management. It has a very small middle management, and when it comes to the upper management is very hands-on. If you're a, quote, low-level employee at Google, you can actually pitch ideas to upper-level management. You don't have to go through middle managers. And Google has a lot of company perks. It's one of the greatest companies to work for, according to its employees. It's got free breakfasts and lunches. It's got fitness classes. It provides vehicle maintenance and other perks as well. All right, now we're going to go into a section of the book that has to do with homosexuality and homosexuality worldwide. And in a previous chapter, we did study gender and culture, and we studied how men and women, in terms of the expectations of their behaviors, is different across the world, and the equality or inequality of men and women is different across the world, and that's the case for homosexuality as well. And so when we're looking at homosexuality and the homosexuals as a subgroup, we're going to be describing the behavior and the words, but some of the behavior and the words that's used to describe homosexualities does not fit with their self-accepted identity. That is, the way that people talk about homosexuals is not accepted by homosexuals itself, and that's very typical of a subgroup. You have those boundaries where the language which the language must conform to. So in many South American and African countries, men who have sex with other men are not actually considering themselves to be homosexuals. As a good example, that's not part of their self-identity. They have a marriage, and then they have something on the side. And this doesn't describe me, but I've talked to people who are gay, and they say they go to gay bars here in the Poconos. There's one near the Fernwood Resort. I forget what it's called. I think it's called the Rainbow Lodge. And at that location, my friend is telling me he sees married men coming in all the time, and then they go home back to their wives. And so that's an example of self-identity does not include homosexuality for people in that lifestyle. Not all countries accept homosexuality. In fact, in some countries, you get the death penalty if you're caught in a homosexual act. We're talking about Saudi Arabia, Yemen, Sudan, Iran, and Nigeria. So imagine that. Whereas same-sex marriage, not just the idea of accepting homosexuality, but of legally accepting the institution of marriage as a union between two people who are homosexual. We have many countries such as the US, Canada, most of Europe, South Africa, which is in Africa, and New Zealand have all passed same-sex marriage. And by the way, that's a fairly new phenomenon. It only came about in the United States within the last 10 years, the strong push for same-sex marriage, and it finally was legalized. And before that, homosexuals were not permitted to be openly homosexual in the military. And so there's a lot of variance about how homosexuals are treated. And there's this term that's used, homophobia, used to describe people who are afraid of being in a conversation with a homosexual, or afraid of being around homosexuals, or afraid of homosexuality existing in their culture. Some of the research that has been done on those value dimensions, those dominant cultural patterns and values that we have studied throughout this class, may not surprise you that religious countries tend to be less accepting of homosexuality, and also countries that are masculine cultures, male cultures, that is where the gender roles are clearly defined, are also less accepting of homosexuality. And by the way, Africa, which is a continent full of countries where homosexuality is widely discriminated against, that was not the situation before colonialization took place, when the Europeans came to Africa and colonized it and took slaves. Before that, homosexuality was more widely practiced. Now let's move on to further clarify the subgroup of homosexuals, as well as the other members of subgroups that are related to lesbians, gays, bisexuals, transsexuals, and queers, LGBTQ. So let's start off with sexual orientation as a basis for subgroups. And the first idea is about sexual orientation and othering. So if we look at the gay movement, it started as a formal movement in 1969 because of a bar fight in New York, where the police came into a gay bar and started busting it up. And the patrons, instead of just acquiescing, they fought back against the police. And this gave rise to the gay liberation movement right in New York. And as part of what that movement did to strengthen its position and reach personal comfort, is they took words that were previously used to other them, words like faggot, words like queer. Those were pejorative words that were meant to speak ill of a group of people, to other them, to push them out, saying they're weird, abnormal. They took those words as part of the gay liberation movement and embraced them, said, I'm a faggot, and get used to it. So it's like they seized control of the language, made it their own language, redefined the language, and redefined in a way the identity of the group. And certain symbols that homosexuals and gay, lesbians, bisexuals, transsexuals, and queers use actually have a history, like the pink triangle. That's another example of language and symbols that have been taken and reformed within the subgroup. The pink triangle was invented by Adolf Hitler and was used in concentration camps to identify, again, gay people. And also the rainbow flag is a very potent symbol today, and rainbow pride marches, all the different colors trying to represent that society is made up of many different people. Some of the consequences of othering, and you know this because you've been in othering groups yourself. Everybody has. You know, I'm an atheist. I'm in an othering group. Some of the consequences of othering are emotional and potential harm. You feel like you don't belong. You feel alienated. You feel like you can't find somebody that you have something in common with. And then there's also physical harm. In fact, there were a lot of hate crimes against homosexuals in the 1990s. We saw a strong rise of homosexual hate crimes in neighborhoods, and flat out murders of people, and chasing them down and beating them up because they are perceived as they are gay. And media played a role in this. For a good 30 years, the Motion Picture Association, located in Hollywood, prohibited the depiction of homosexuality in films for 30 years. So homosexuality is, the consequences of othering homosexuality has led to a lot of serious harm to people as a member of that subgroup. And also discrimination in the workplace has been something that homosexuals have had to face. The ability to get a job if you appear to be gay has been something that people have been discriminated against. And we do have laws that are slowly trying to address those situations. For the homosexual subgroup, one of the ways that they seize control of their own destiny as a subgroup is through media, their own media. Maybe not say their own media, but media that catered to their causes. So there's a lot of specialized print media. The Blade was the very first gay newspaper that came out of Washington. That's now online. And then there's a lot of gay literature. Some of the literature was not so comforting to homosexuals. The literature of, for example, of James Baldwin, Truman Capote, Gore Vidal. I don't know if you know those authors. People don't read too much today, but those authors depicted gay men as outsiders. But combating that, you had gay magazines, and gay magazines started to promote the causes of the subgroup of LGBTQ in many areas, including health, such as the AIDS epidemic that arose for some time, which was said to be, a death sentence in the 1970s. But today, people like Magic Johnson are able to live with AIDS. And so you have gay magazines. And then what really changed things for gay people was just flat out capitalism. And we study this in Intro to Mass Media, which I teach. I'm teaching it this fall. And what happened was advertisers realized that the gay market is a very, very lucrative market to advertise to. Why? Because gay couples typically, although this is changing, don't have children. So they don't have that extra expense that they have to spend their income on. Also, gay people tend to be more educated than not. So they have a higher level of discretion when they're choosing things that they want to purchase. And because of their education, they tend to be more affluent. So when it all comes down to it, gay people have more, generally speaking, compared to heterosexuals, they have more discretionary income. That means money that they can spend on whatever they want. And then, of course, there's the internet and gay porn, which has opened up the door to feeling of open sexuality for gay people, not having to go hide in secret clubs and bars. It's right in their home. So there used to be a single identity that was associated with LGBT, which is now LGBTQ, the Q standing for queer or questioning. But really, each person or each subgroup within that larger group has its own issues in their own language. So now let's go on to from separation to assimilation. That's ultimately what we're trying to get to with a subgroup, because a subgroup, again, does not have the power that a subculture does. The subgroup is subverted to the will of the dominant culture and therefore often feels oppressed. So how do we get a subgroup from separation from otherness to assimilation, to be assimilated in the culture? And so what we do is we study how the use of language can change the status of a subgroup within a culture over time. And a good example of that Fred Yant talks about is gay speak. Gay speak is used in situations where gay people feel threatened. It's used in social settings where gay people are around other people. And it's used in radical gay activism, protests, and marches. But when gay people are sometimes around people who are not representative of those three groups that I just mentioned, gay speak is more hidden. There's a kind of a double life that goes on there. A gay person, at least as far as I understand, is having to decide all the time, do I reveal that I'm gay through my actions, my body language, my tone, or do I keep it hidden until I find out if the other person is going to be accepting? And that's where gay speak comes into the equation. I can tell you, I would watch the waiters. There were a lot of gay waiters when I was in the restaurant, and they would go out and serve people, and they would speak like a quote unquote normal, quote unquote normal American language. But when they came back in the kitchen, they were calling each other queens and my love. So that was because the comfort level was much increased when they were around other gay people, as well as people like myself who are accepting. What's to accept? That's their choice, it's their life. They're accepting of me, I'm accepting of them. So gay speak is a way of doing away with the subversion of homosexuality. And the Gay Pride March is another example of assimilation. It's like saying we are going to be out in public. I went to Germany last summer, and there was a monstrous Gay Pride March in the city of Hanover, which my wife and I went to, and the caravan stretched on for miles, and they had double-decker buses, and it stopped the city in its tracks, saying, listen, like it or not, we are here, we're here to stay, we're happy about it, we're prideful, we are fun people, we're going to do this peacefully, and then we're going to be done. And this is one of the ways that separation to assimilation can occur in a society. So there are some things for you to think about as you go about your way, and to apply not just the specialized case studies that we talked about today, but also to think about in your own life, what subgroups are you a member of? And those subgroups feel some oppression. How can you get those subgroups to move more into an assimilation mode within the society. That's for you to consider. Have a great day.